Welcome to Baseball and Coffee, episode 42 with Tino and Aaron. What's up, Aaron?
Usual. How about you?
I'm good. Usual. Uh, Excited for the stretch run. Nervous about the Mariners imploding a little bit, uh, but still ready. Playoff baseball is gonna be a lot of fun. This
Yeah.
episode, we're gonna cover a couple things. What we've learned since the beginning of this season, as far as our fantasy teams go, some things that we might do differently with roster construction in 23. I'll give my top 5 dynasty shortstop prospects and get some feedback from Aaron on that. He's going to give some things that he's looking for in, or that he's seen or looking for in uh, current major league shortstops, and I'll give my feedback on that, and then we'll do some open forum and open some cards. You got any coffee updates, coffee stories?
I do. Yeah, I have a couple. I didn't keep them close enough, but a couple coffees I've been drinking. I bought more $8 Target Good and Gather Organic
Nice.
Nicaragua medium roast. Um, First cup I had, I thought was a little unclean,
Mm-hmm.
uh, but it also tasted a little over extracted, so I might have missed my mark on my water.
Sure.
Then I also have something a little bit more special. A coworker of mine, Sean, bought me some limited release medium roast from Pete's Coffee.
Uh-huh.
It's like a hand scooped paper bag,
Sweet.
very fall-y,
Uh-huh.
like illustration on the front. It's called Wine and Walnut.
Mm-hmm.
Again, it's a medium roast. Trio of coffees from Burundi, Yemen, and Sumatra.
Huh.
Yeah, so two African and one Asia Pacific. So I had my cup last night. I was kind of in a stupor, so I need to spend some more time with it to really get to know it. Maybe on a day when I've had a night's sleep. But yeah, I'm just always exciting to have new coffees around, and of course, always thought people give you coffee.
Right. That's awesome.
So I'll report back again once I get to know a little bit better on the old wine and walnut.
Sweet. I don't have a whole lot to report. I still been thinking a lot about roasting still, and I haven't certainly haven't pulled the trigger on any sort of fancy roaster or anything like that. But I think as the fall and winter comes and you start to kind of hunker down and be inside, that's something that I'll pursue a little bit more. I'm still on the standard brew a pot of coffee, 43 grams of coffee ground on an 18 on the Baratza and into the coffee brewer. So nothing super crazy to report on that end. And I did have one of my iced coffee milkshakes, by the way, which was super amazing from a couple episodes
I
ago.
just rewatched the episode that where you're drinking that, and I was shaking my head the whole time.
It was so good. It was so freaking good. All right, let's dig in. So what we've learned since the beginning of the 22 season, I guess the first thing that kind of came, so two things came to mind for me immediately. The first one is, and some of this is going to be pretty obvious to folks, but these are learnings, personal learnings for me based on my teams and some of the ways in which I've changed my roster or roster construction over the course of the last couple of years. First one is innings are king. I think that that's the first thing for me that comes to mind. So one of my approaches this year was to try to bring on more elite starting pitching. Um, I think for any league, one of the things we have to think about is how is starting pitching valued on the draft board, and how is it valued in the trade market in your league? Because if starting pitching is incredibly expensive, obviously um, finding elite starting pitching or lots of innings is going to be more expensive. What do you think? What is your perception of the market in our league?
I was thinking about something else, and you said, and I lost the
That's
second
okay.
half of that question. I heard you were
I
talking about innings, and you said evaluating the market. Can you repeat
mhm.
the question just so I answer accurately?
So I was saying that innings are key or king. And but evaluating the cost of starting pitching in your particular league is, I think, the first step in trying to put together a deep starting staff. In a
Okay.
league in which starting pitching is inexpensive, I think that you can accumulate starting pitching and really kind of have an advantage over other teams. In a league where starting pitching is more expensive, I do think that it's other approaches, such as relievers that don't accumulate saves but have really great ratios, can be a different approach. But what I was asking you is what is your perception of the starting pitching market in our particular league?
I think that we have a handful of owners that look to move away from a pitcher when he reaches his peak value. So I think there is a little bit of a dynamic when someone's doing really well. If it's not, I'm not talking about like a top 5, 6 starter, but someone who maybe is a pops up for a top 15, top 20 season, they look maybe to try to maximize that value.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and yeah, I think the way relievers are treated are fairly attainable. Maybe the only exception is a lockdown closer.
Sure.
You don't see a lot of those moved. Even on teams that are not contending, they want to hold those over as one of their keepers.
Right.
But other relievers are very acquirable,
Mhm.
and whether for picks or just very very reasonable compensation. And a lot of times,
Right.
when you have open lines of communication, people have reached out to you, and you even know someone's available. It's just a matter of them trying to deal with a roster crunch.
Right. One of the other thoughts with as far as innings go as well is that you can obviously you can kind of overwhelm your we're talking about head to head here. You can overwhelm another team with strikeouts if you have enough deep starters and they don't kill your ratios. The other thing is you can drown out, I was thinking about the fact that I had rostered David Bednar and Mark Melanson as my two closers at the beginning of the year. And Melanson, I thought, would get saves, but would have horrible ratios potentially. But the thought process was quality, lots of quality innings from starters can kind of drown out the one reliever who's giving you a category like saves, but is not necessarily a great pitcher.
Hmm.
So again, my first learning is innings are key. I don't know in a head-to-head league that if you can get by. What is your minimum? I guess I should ask you, what is your minimum number of starters in a rotation for a head-to-head league?
I think for us, it has to be 6 is the answer because you have to have 6 starts a week. So unless you're going to stream, for me, I wouldn't want to have any less than 6. I think 7's kind of been my target all year.
Mm-hmm.
I've had as many as 9 and as few as 5.
Mm-hmm.
But 7's kind of been my target
Mm-hmm.
because to your point about, strikeouts, if you have 7 and you have, one or two starts, you're hopefully in a position where if you have quality enough stuff, you're going to be competing in strikeouts.
Right. One more thought. I think that the diversity in um, diversity in pitchers is important in a rotation, meaning, not everyone can have three aces, right? And but to be ahead of the curve and be able to find some of those 5 and 6 inning starters and some of those young guys that are going to be able to give you quality innings but may not give you really long starts is super important, and to try to double up on some of those because there is the threat at the end of the season of them not pitching nearly as much as they did in the beginning with innings limits. It's not something that I thought about a ton coming into this season. I rostered Kirby and I understood that if he came up, there might be some innings cap or innings limitations. I didn't realize it was going to impact my rotation as much as it might down the stretch. So that's my first learning. Do you want to give your first?
Sure. Um, I'm viewing just to be candid about the next couple segments we have, I'm
Sure.
uh, not viewing my management or my team in the greatest light. So my comments might come off kind of pointed. My first learning is I have to trust my spring training takeaways um, more strongly. A couple of reasons this was on my mind. Uh, I watched Shane McClanahan pitch yesterday. Was thinking back to He was on my list of players to target based on what he was doing in the spring.
Mm-hmm.
He went late in our draft, and then he was cut once he was sent to AAA. So I had two chances to acquire him, someone that I was really bought into his skill, and I never pulled the trigger.
Mm-hmm.
And now he's unacquirable. And this year I had written down on my notebook Spencer Strider and Johan Duran, and I ended up with one of them. Um, and 1 out of 3 isn't good enough. And I just have to figure out a way when I find these guys that I'm writing them down as these are guys I want to get. I need to find ways to get them. And um, I need to figure that out.
So what, let me ask you, what is, because I have something similar, but I'm interested, why do you think you don't kind of follow through or complete the transaction with some of those guys? What is it that's hindering you? Because I do think that this is a deeper question for a lot of fantasy managers and not just in baseball. What is it that's impacting you and hindering you from acquiring some of those guys?
It's not fully formed, but my thought is that it's an unwillingness to take a short-term loss for a long-term gain. It's using those roster spots for a second catcher, for rostering 7 or 8 relievers to compete in holds in the first month of the season, being unwilling to take losses in categories early on, again, for a longer term payoff.
Sure. So along those same lines, and I think this might have been my biggest takeaway is I have in my notes, I'll just read the notes, believe in your scouting. And I think that rings very true for both of us. We invest a lot of time and a lot of energy in baseball and digging and understanding and numbers and watching video. And at some point in time, I think we have to consider ourselves equals to anyone else that's out there. And so what I put was, don't be short-sighted, which is pretty much what you're saying. Current ratings matter less than what your scouting eyes tell you, because I think there are a lot of lists out there, right? And there are a lot of people putting content out there, and there's a lot of what have you done for me lately? And I think that what I'm seeing is I'm seeing experts and lists come out that are with new players up top, right? If you think about minor league, we'll talk about minor league shortstops later, but you think about minor league players and you see someone like Gunnar Henderson, who was not a top prospect coming into the season, but is currently the #1 prospect. Some of it is graduation, but I think a lot of it is just recency bias. Jackson Churio is another one. Whereas for me, I'm starting to move way more back towards actual scouting. And what is that player, not what has he done statistically, but who is that player? What is his skill set? And what do you think it's going to look like down the road? I've got more on that later. So the other notes I have, so current ratings matter less than what your scouting eyes tell you, especially the ratings of others, meaning create your own ratings and trust those. I said, we know as much as any expert. Hell, we are experts. If you invest time and energy in learning, you make your own decisions and stick with them, right? And so someone like Strider, so here's a good example. I wasn't a huge Strider fan coming into the season. I thought he was for sure a reliever. You argued that he was a starter, as did Matt. Ironically, I'm the one who rosters him now. But I think that having the ability to just say, you know what, I believe in this guy, I'm going to keep him, and believing in talent over, like, as you said, short-term gain is super duper important. I do think that's going to change for me going into 23. I'm going to hold really, really fast to my belief in particular players and their talent, and trust what my eyes say. I think I've done a pretty good job of that this year, but I'm the more I learn, the more I'm willing to strictly trust what I think, and also not be influenced by others. I think, we have particular people that we follow or that we believe, they're not always right either. So,
Right.
and I think that's a really important thing to incorporate into your decision making. But I appreciate the candor and the willingness to be honest about some of those things. I think that's really huge in becoming a better player. The next thing I have, if we're just going to stick with pitching, is bullpens are fungible. I think if any of us look at what our bullpens looked like coming into the season and what they look like now, you realize um, just how fungible bullpens truly are in fantasy baseball, and how it's really hard to predict and understand who's going to be a closer and who's not. Um, so you look at where what I have written down in my notes are, look at where Liam Hendricks and Josh Hader were being drafted in TGFBI and NFBC leagues, right? They're being
Yeah.
drafted. So at some point, they were drafted what in the second round, and certainly 2-3 turn was kind of the lowest you were seeing them go. And Hendricks has been okay, and Hader is not closing right now, right? So I think, and then for us, we are in a holds league as well. I think that my learning is I've always said holds guys are easy to find, but I do think that the dominant holds guys are less so, and I may value them a bit more heading into next season. The one big thing is, and I think both of us do this incredibly well, is being able to identify players or pitchers with the stuff to be dominant relievers before they actually are considered dominant relievers. And that's a way to continue. So I think both of us will cycle through those guys. I've traded a ton of them as they've gotten better. So you pick them up, they establish themselves, they establish value, and then you're able to get future value for those particular pitchers. There's a number of people in our league that are able to do that, but it's something that I think this is the first year that I've actually been good at it. I just think it's interesting. Look at the closer rankings coming into the year, and look who's actually the best closers now.
Right.
Any comments on bullpens?
No, I don't think so.
All right. What's your next learning?
So the learning I have is it's a self-realization that I really have a fixation on certain stats and certain metrics, and my dedication to those really eliminates too narrow, it makes the pool too narrow. And I think I just miss opportunities to just make my roster more dynamic. Just to give an example, we're going to talk about shortstops. And so I filtered all the shortstops who had accumulated 100 at bats, and I filtered by that entire list players who had a better than an average walk rate, which is 8.4%, is the league average, and a better than league average strikeout rate, which is less than 22%. That generated a list of 6 players.
Right.
6 players, 6 shortstops.
Right.
Of those 6, 3 of them had a sub 650 OPS. So they're bringing those plate skills, but they don't have anything else to offer. That means I have 3 players that meet that criteria of what I would consider a good plate approach. So I do that illustration, not to delve down into shortstop, but to try to illustrate what I mean. My fixation on plate approach and swinging strike rate, not that those are not sound things, but my just devotion to it has to be reevaluated.
I think that's it's funny because we're going on this, I see it as a journey, like this fantasy baseball journey together in some ways, and coming to a lot of similar realizations. And it's not, just for listeners' sake, we don't discuss a lot of this coming into the pod, right? We just have a really basic outline.
Yeah.
And so we're asking each other questions and sharing things that we're not, that the other person isn't aware of ahead of time. And I think you're right. And I think if I can comment on your approach just for a second, I think it's a really astute realization. It's something that I have seen from you at times this year is this process of using specific filters. And I do think that it creates blind spots to players who might not fit a certain criteria, but are still really, really productive players. I think, picking up Andres Jimenez, right? Jimenez doesn't fit a lot of what I'm looking for as far as approach goes, because walk rate is incredibly important for me. And I don't think he has a great hit tool. I think he has, he's got some power and he's got some speed, but I needed a second baseman, and I picked him up and then cut him and picked him up again, and I got lucky. But I think it's a great learning that you can find incredibly valuable players who don't fit, the mold of what you're looking for. But really, baseball is a really diverse sport, right?
Hmm.
And the superstars all have different approaches. Some superstars have great walk rates, and some don't walk at all. I had to check myself because Byron Buxton has been one of the players that I've always loved. His walk rate isn't great. His swinging strike rate is horrible, but he's still a very valuable fantasy player, right? And so I actually did list both. So I started to think in those terms, just like you, because I had to check myself because I have players on my team that don't fit exactly what I'm looking for. And what I found was I was trying to think of, okay, that what are the stats or the approaches that I have to have in hitters? And what I came up with, my list was, I said hit tool above all else, because I think if you are a player with physicality and you have a above average hit tool, that's kind of the baseline for a good offensive baseball player. We talked about Robert Hassel last week,
Right.
and I think when you compare, and then we both rostered Elijah Green for a while. I really want Elijah Green to succeed. I love players like that, but I'm scared shitless of a 40 or 45 hit tool and that much swing and miss, no matter how physical you are. I think about, like, who's a good example of, like, Courtney. Do you remember Courtney Hawkins? He was a minor league first round pick of the White Sox a number of years ago, but he's an
I don't.
outfielder, tons of physicality. Monty Harrison is another one.
Oh,
Um,
I know him.
yeah, so those types of players, I love them. But if your hit tool, if you got a below average hit tool, it's a hard hole to dig out of, right? Versus Hassel, who may have 20 to 25 home run upside as a ceiling, but the hit tool's there. And it's a good place to start. So for me, hit tool is incredibly important. Walk rate is, I think, I won't say it's a must, but I think it's a big deal. And I think if you were to put together a team full of players with below average walk rates, you would start to see your run production go down. Your OPS is not quite what you want it to be. There are multiple stats that are impacted by walk rate. Um, Swinging strike is important to me. It's not quite as important in a hitter as it is with the pitcher for me, but it's still important. Obviously, you're looking for exit velocity, but I do think we get caught up in average and max exit velocities without, especially in young players, without actually taking into context what the history of that player is leading up to that point in time. One of the things I want to bring up with minor leaguers is, when we talk about minor league shortstops, is think about the difference in. So Marcelo Myers from Southern California, right? 6'3", beautiful left-handed stroke, um, looks like a first-round pick, swings like a first-round pick. Jackson Holliday, number one pick overall this year by the Orioles. His father, we all know his father, Matt Holliday, right? Like, all-star outfielder. So these guys are growing up in hotbeds of baseball with all the nutrition and the teaching and the videos and the instructs and the travel ball that you could ever imagine, right? Then you take Noelvi Marte, or you take Marco Luciano, right? You're taking players from Venezuela, you're taking players from the Dominican, and you think about the instruction that they've been given, and you think about the resources they have, right? The private instructors that they don't have, or the nutritional information that they don't have, or what it even takes. You hear stories of what it takes a player to just get to the field, or the fact that their mitt is a piece of paper, whatever the case is, right? So if you take Marte or Luciano at age, I don't know, 19 or 20, and you take Holiday or Marcelo Meyer at age 19 or 20, their exit velocities are on different curves, because the players from with less resources may not have reached their peak yet, physically, right? or they might have a steeper curve or a steeper kind of progression to get there. Whereas someone like Meyer or Holiday has been groomed to play baseball since they were 5 in
Right.
environments with every resource. And I
Right.
don't think that's something that we discuss. And I do think it really does impact some of the measurables. So as an example, if we're sorting for exit velocity in minor leagues, right, as we get more statistics, to me, you can't compare a 19-year-old from the Dominican versus a 19-year-old from the States, right? It's just not, they're not coming from the same place.
Right.
And I think it's not, that's something that is missed if we're strictly sticking to measurables. And it's why, to me, I'm starting to go further toward, as much as I love numbers, again, further towards the actual scouting portion of understanding who a baseball player is, especially when they're young. But I think it applies to the conversation about believing in your scouting, and it applies to the conversation about sorting by specific statistics. Um, I love this. This is something that I think is a conversation that's been coming, or a realization that's been coming for both of us all season long. I think this is great. The only other statistic that I wanted to bring up as far as looking at hitters, I think launch angle is just super important. Not that it has to be a specific number, but that the outliers in the bottom at the low end and the high end are, I think, even more dangerous as far as rostering them and wanting them to become better from a launch angle perspective. Or a player like Colton Wong, who doesn't have a ton of power, but is trying to jack home runs all the time, who would be a much more productive player if he just stopped trying to uppercut everything all the time, right? Anyways, that's you have
He is a middle of the order run producer after all now.
he's not.
Again.
That he is not. What are your thoughts on some of those some of my perspective on, you know, comparing young players like that and scouting?
I think it gets into some more soft science. I don't want to say makeup, but yeah, certainly background and that can play a role in like how driven they are to succeed. And also, to your point, how they take to coaching, that could both be positive or negative from both sides of that, of the comparison that you made. You can be resistant to coaching because you've had private instructors, or you can be really open to coaching because you're used to it. The same by the player who hasn't had a lot of coaching could soak it up like a sponge and thrive, and another player that might frustrate them. And you know what I mean? So but I do think there's value in like keeping that sort of, especially on the development curve, because it's just not going to be straight up or straight down in most cases. So looking at it with a little bit more nuance, a little bit more humanity, as on that arc, as it ebbs and flows, I think would be something that has a lot of wisdom.
It's funny because it's the same conversation that as baseball fans we were having 20 years ago, as numbers and sabermetrics were starting to come to light. You know, it was kind of the power was on the side of the scouting, and there was we all know that huge debate between which is more important and which is king. I think, like anything else, the truth is somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
If you simply scout without understanding numbers, you're not you're not utilizing all the resources. But if we're looking strictly at numbers and sorting by numbers and eliminating players, to your point, because they don't fit a specific framework or profile, then we're losing sight of, you know, the high potential player that might not be at that place in their learning curve, right? So
Yeah.
I just think that the truth is somewhere, like anything else, the truth is somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, the numbers should be part of the story, not the story. I was watching the Pirates game yesterday, and O'Neill Cruz hit the hardest ball in the Statcast era. I saw it live, and both the announcers, and it was the Pittsburgh broadcast, so take that with however you may, but they couldn't believe the sound off the bat. And when they heard the number, they weren't surprised. They were like, I completely believe that based on the trajectory. They said it was still going up when it hit the wall and the sound that it made. So the numbers matched the experience and what they saw.
Right.
And so it's a way to it's like confirmation, or like that really was amazingly powerful strike.
Right.
But the number, again, it's a way to tell or illustrate the story. It shouldn't be the story. And I think I think I can do a better job balancing that for sure.
Hmm. Yeah, I think we're also all, no fantasy player is a finished product either. Meaning,
Yeah,
the more we're able to be genuinely objective about our own um, blind spots, and the more I think we see ourselves as learning and getting better all the time, the better player you become, right?
right,
And there just is no formula. Baseball is such a dynamic um, thing. The way that players swing is different this year than it was last year. The way that pitchers pitch is different this year than the way it was last year. So to apply a blanket formula, and expect it to work without trying to change that formula is you're going to lose, right? I think that's ultimately what we're talking about here. Um, One of the other things I have that I think is something I've tried to do in the past, but I see it as even more important now, is identifying, from roster construction standpoint, identifying who your core is, and then continuously trying to make incremental improvements on the margins, and not being afraid to do that. Um, but also in our league specifically, we have a limited number of waiver claims, making sure that I'm not becoming so obsessed with my 5 minor league players that I waste waiver claims on the next hot minor league player, instead of using that waiver claim on incremental improvement for the current year. So that's one shift that I would like to make for next year, is to identify the minor league players that I want to keep in my 5 slots, and riding with them, believing in my scouting coming into the season of those players, not going up and down with their performance, and using all my claims on trying to make my team better in the immediate, I think is super duper important. Uh, any comments on that? It feels like a pretty obvious one, right?
no, I think it was well said.
And the only other thing I really have as far as what I want to do different next year is, I think, even greater focus on so the two things I have in my notes are: OPS is king. OPS impacts multiple categories. And I think really so speaking about going the other side, establishing a really hard floor for what my OPS minimum is at each position, based on the talent that's available at that position, is something I will do next year. I think that if you have a decent OPS floor for your entire team, you can put together a competitive team even without speed, because OPS impacts everything else. And then the other one I have is that position in the batting order needs to be diversified. So I have a lot of leadoff hitters, which in theory sounds good, right? You've got a lot of at bats, you've got a lot of opportunity. Typically, a lot of those players steal bases, but it also means fewer RBIs. And so that's a category that I don't produce as much in. And so I will try to target a more diversified players with more diversified positions in the batting order next year as well. You have any other thoughts to share as far as improvements for next year?
Yeah, I think you've talked about construction a little bit. I didn't know if we officially moved there, but it sounds like you kind of blended it in, which makes perfect sense. Um, I think for me, this isn't by no means refined, but I think I just need to. I think sometimes the way I construct my roster is too much like a sim, or too much like again, certain player type. So I just as an example, like I like guys that are really good defenders. And that's not because I mean there is some small fantasy implications, but just because those are the guys I enjoy watching.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the kind of athletes that I like. I'd hate having guys support a defender and like owning him and rostering him.
Mm-hmm.
So the value or what that means to me to have that guy on my team, um, I need to either continue down that path and accept that that means that I may not be as competitive, or I'm going to need to change the way I formulate. And you were talking a little bit about batting order. I tend to have guys who have very similar skills. And while those skills, like if you put them on a sim team and let them run, they would complement each other and produce a lot of runs. But when your players are drawing a walk and they play for the Rangers or the Angels, they're probably not going to score.
Mhm.
So going over 3 with a walk and 2 hard hit balls and no runs or RBI doesn't really do any good.
Mhm.
You know what I mean?
Right.
So when they hit the ball, they're hitting it hard, they have a good plate approach. But again, just getting on base. Now, if you had a whole lineup of guys beside, like one stacked on one top of the other in real life, that would have an attrition aspect on the pitcher, right? They would drive each other in, they would create opportunities, they would force the pitcher to get in the strike zone.
Mhm.
This is not the way the game is played. So I tend to build my roster in this way of like all these guys, I'm like, oh, this is great. But again, you take them out of my lineup and you put them on each individual teams, they don't complement each other enough.
Right.
So there's no answer to how I'm going to do it differently. I just realized the shortcomings of what I've built.
Mhm. It's a very we're gonna take a quick break, but I'll come back with my response to that because it brought up some really great memories and some bad memories about some sim stuff that I put together when I was younger. We'll be right back. So I have to share two things real quickly. One is that I am while we're recording, this is so typical of us. While we're recording, I'm having a debate with Matt about Corbin Carroll's when it comes to making dinner, less than perfect zone contact rate, and he's asking me where did I get Corbin Carroll's zone contact rate statistics, and so we're talking about what I've seen versus actually finding the number. But I find it funny that I'm having this debate about this minor league player on my phone while we're recording. I apologize, but I think it's funny. What I was thinking of as you were sharing the team construction kind of observation that you had, in dynasty baseball or Pursue the Pennant, which is like Stratomatic, that I played as when I was younger, which I loved, by the way. I wish I had a league of that now. I built my team. We're talking about like late 90s, early 2000s. I built my offense based on OBP, and I paid zero attention to power, and I paid some attention to defense, but OBP was king. And it's kind of I guess the Moneyball process a little bit. But that team was dominant, right? Every year I won all the time because I had figured this thing out. But how a high OBP kind of lesser hit tool, lesser power sort of team would play out in real life is completely different than it did in Pursue the Pennant. And I think that, especially in the playoffs, right? Because we all know that as in playoff baseball, you've got to be able to hit. But I appreciate your comment about, kind of putting together a sim team versus a fantasy baseball team. And it made me think, I tend to look at, I know that there's a lot of conversation preseason in the fantasy community about putting together a team of players that complement each other from a statistical standpoint. And I think that there has to be some of that thought, but each position, ultimately, if you just look for the best player at each position or the most talented player at each position, most statistics, probably outside of stolen bases, offensively speaking, are going to be covered. And I think to choose a player that complements a lesser player that complements your team instead of choosing the best player at that position I guess that's another learning for me heading into next year is just find the best player at that position and worry about how they complement each other later. I know that's a conversation we had before the season started. Have your thoughts changed as far as kind of how each player complements one another and whether you see each individual position as trying to acquire the best possible player at that position versus the player that complements your team?
I think you do that at the end. Yeah, I think you do that on the margins, like you said. The players that comes to mind was like Dylan Cease. We drafted him when you were taking on a little bit of risk, and I think that influenced some of the pitchers that we took after.
Hmm.
But it wasn't as if he was the fulcrum for all of our decisions. But we certainly we looked at the type of players we were acquiring, and things like that. And I remember I famously, well, maybe we'll become famous, and I have no idea. Like I said, I don't want to draft Julio Rodriguez yet. I want to wait until we like have one more outfielder, so we're not like relying on him and let's take our outfielder three, which
Hmm.
looks asinine now because he's an outfield one.
Right.
But at that time, it was like I don't want to take that risk on just yet, not yet. So
Mhm.
yeah, I mean, like I said, it's ultimately the way that our teams perform is based on statistics and acquiring statistics. And I think my comment about building a roster that would do well in a sim or something like that, or if they were on a real team together, which I really do believe that it's not the same. And you don't get any extra points for, oh, your three outs were a hard hit,
Right.
or you didn't swing at anything that wasn't your pitch, or, you know, how many times your guys left standing on first base. Like,
Sure.
we don't get points for that.
Sure.
So if you really want to win, if it's win at all costs, there's going to have to be some adjustments. And if
Hmm.
you want to keep playing the way you're playing, you have to accept that.
Right. Well, think about Stephen Kwan, right? I love what so Stephen Kwan fits a lot of or checks a lot of boxes for me in that I love watching him play. I really wanted to find an excuse to roster Stephen Kwan. And he was cut by by Smurf in our league because I think Smurf because he had low OPS and he wasn't hitting for power and his metrics are just all super weird, right? His hard hit, his barrel are just bottom, I think 1 or 2%. But he's an old school hitter that makes contact with the ball. And what's interesting is he's now like a high 700s OPS guy, even though he's not hitting a ton of home runs. He's made himself into a high 700s OPS guy because he's such a good hitter, but he doesn't fit the profile of the types of players that I think we immediately roster. And I just think he's a really good example of how we just have to continuously try to morph or shift what we're looking for in a productive player. Because fact of the matter is, he's been a pretty productive outfield three,
Yeah.
and I like having him on my team. And he impacts the hit category and he impacts the runs category. He's got some impact on stolen bases as well. Um, so I think this is a good segue into. Do you want to go first with the shortstop stuff, or should we cover the minors
No,
first?
I'd like to do yours first, and then I'll just share kind of legit, like why I thought that might be interesting to look at the data that I did.
Cool.
Yeah, please, let's go to shortstops.
So what we talked about earlier, I think, is a good, if we overlay this on top of minor league shortstops, I'm going to give my top 5 minor league shortstops, but I have to preface it with the more this year, I've kind of concluded that what I'm looking for in each offensive player is, if I can find it, I'm looking for a baseline of power and a baseline of speed. And those players are the ones, if there's a deficit anywhere, obviously you want at least one elite tool, and sometimes that can cover up something else. But the best prospects to me are the ones who are going to help you in each category and have elite potential in at least one category. So I should also say that I did not rank Ellie De La Cruz, Gunnar Henderson, or Marco Luciano in my shortstops because my belief is De La Cruz is going to become a corner outfielder. I think um, I don't think he'll stay at short just because of his frame. I could see him moving to third, but given the prospects in the Reds organization, if they do come to fruition, I think De La Cruz ends up in the outfield. Gunnar Henderson, I think, is going to be a third baseman. I think Holiday plays shortstop. He might be shortstop eligible for a year or two, but ultimately he's a third baseman. And Luciano is probably second or third base. I could also see him in a corner. So I'll put those guys off to the side. My run through 5 is I have Anthony Volpe at 1, Noelvi Marte at 2, Marcelo Mayer at 3, Jordan Lawler at 4, and Jackson Holiday at 5. Volpe kind of fits what I was talking about as far as not having any real deficiency, having 30 home run potential, 30 stolen base potential, high walk rate. There aren't any real big holes in his game. I do think he muscles up a little bit to try to hit balls out. His swing is a bit leveraged for me, but he, to me, fantasy wise, it has the highest upside of any of the players in the top 5. If we were talking about real life, I don't know if he would be my number 1 shortstop. That's the other takeaway from ranking the top 5 shortstops for me, is there's an enormous difference in a fantasy or dynasty shortstop or position player versus real life. I think Volpe is barely a shortstop defensively and could potentially become a second baseman down the road. I don't think he will, especially in that park on that team, but he's not a very good shortstop, which is why I think we see him ranked a little bit higher in dynasty format than we do in real life. Real quick background on Volpe. Fangraphs has hit tool 60, game power 60, raw power 55, speed 50. He's had double-digit walk rates through the minors. His K rate was peaked in rookie ball at 25.3, but he's, it's well known that he's made a bunch of adjustments since rookie ball. It's 17.5% this year. Last year in A and high A at 27 home runs and 33 steals. One of the other things I like about him is his batting average of balls in play has not been really out of line or an outlier yet in his career. So a lot of the numbers I think you can take a little bit more in a little bit more concrete fashion. Some of the notes I have on him: his effort in his swing, it looks like an uppercut swing. He's got this weird little squat as the pitch is thrown. He's almost kind of jumping at the ball as he swings the bat. So there's a lot of timing in his swing that makes me a little bit nervous as well. But he's incredibly explosive, and I think there's a lot of twitch in him that gives him the ability to hit for power. I also like the fact that he struggled earlier this year. He really did struggle, and people were kind of questioning whether last year was a fluke. And he's really recovered and made adjustments to get back to that prospect status that he had coming into this year. And for me, seeing a player struggle and make adjustments and have the mental fortitude to be able to do that is really important. We've seen players like Jared Kelenic never struggle in the minors, come up to the majors and not really know how to adjust. So I like to see some of those ups and downs before a player hits the major leagues. What I see in him is a hitter that's going to be in the top third of the Yankees order probably next year, in a really productive offense, in a park that's conducive to home runs. I do think he'll stick at short because of organizational need. And I see his floor as a shortstop with the 2020 shortstop with a high walk rate in a really great park on a really good offensive team. And I do think there's 30-30 potential. So he's my number 1. Number 2 is Noelvi Marte. I think that he has been, I talk about him damn near every podcast. I think he's been underrated quite a bit. I think he was bored in A ball. Like I said, when I saw him play, he looked pretty bored. He's got the biggest power of any of these 5, I think, hands down. Fangraphs had his hit tool at 45. I would rate it more like a 55. They did have his gain power as 60 and his raw as 70. If you see him, he is, I wouldn't say that he's thick or big, but he's strong. And he looks like an athlete. He looks like he could, play safety basically in the NFL. I'm in my notes, I have bored in A ball, built to play baseball, lower average, but if you his hit tool, if you watch him hit, the swing looks like he can hit for average. I just don't think he has yet. Very smooth player. His focus has waned a little bit, but again, I think part of that is just being an A ball. I see him as the type of talent that will focus more as he progresses against better pitching. In the majors, he's probably a 10% walk guy. I don't think he's ever going to have a high OBP. And he's probably going to be a 20 plus strikeout guy, but he has 40 home run potential in that bat. That's big, big, big power. And it's not a leverage swing at all. It's a very smooth swing. And then he's going to be playing in Cincinnati. So as long as they don't move the fences back, he's got opportunity to play in a really home run friendly park. The other part is his, again, when you rate him, when prospect outlets rate him, they're rating him as a baseball player. But if you think of him as a fantasy player and you subtract his defense, he could be, the reason why he's not number one for me is that I don't see him stealing 20 bases. And that's something that I value out of the shortstop position. But like I said, he definitely probably has the most power potential of anybody at this position. I think it's telling that Baseball Prospectus midseason had him as their number 28 prospect, but he's their number 12 dynasty prospect. So that's where that defensive, that below average defense, you're seeing it in the rankings pipeline, had him as the 18th, their 18th overall and their number 8 shortstop prospect overall. But they tend to, they're obviously looking at the overall picture of Noelvi Marte, and they tend to, in my opinion, overvalue draft pedigree. And so I think that's part of why he's lower on their list. What are your thoughts on the first two, on Volpe and Marte?
Is Volpe in Double A now?
Triple A.
He's in Triple A.
They
Okay.
did move him up to Triple A, yeah.
And Marte is in Double A.
Marte, I believe, is still in High A with Cincinnati, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay.
But I think he's just turned 20.
Yeah. So Volpe, what I noticed with him, it's funny when you described his swing, I was smiling just out of being pleased with myself that I had the same takeaway as you, because I really have incorporated video and from our collaboration, but I wrote down, lots of lift, and it really has a pronounced load. He almost seems to squat on his back leg, his right leg, and lower his head, and really has a lot of lift in his swing from that. That's what I noticed with his right-handed swing. His stature kind of reminded me of the injured Atlanta Braves shortstop or second baseman, whose name always escapes me whenever I try to
Ozzy
reference him.
Albies. Yeah.
Thank you. He seems a little stronger than Albies, but his stature reminded me of Albies. It's not a player comp, just a purely like size comp. I know Marte, what I noticed with him, he seemed really excessively patient. Even he did a lot of strikes that he didn't swing at. He seemed like he was hunting his pitch. I didn't see a lot of video where he made a lot of great contacts. I didn't get a sense of his like pure raw power, but I do see when I was pulling up the tools on Fangraphs that they had his raw at a 70. And the only other player on their list that had a 70 raw was Luciano, who we're not considering as a shortstop. So, yeah, those are my thoughts on those first two.
I roster Volpe and do not roster Marte, but I am in love with Noelvi Marte. I think he's a star in the making. I really, really do. He's a cool customer, and part of it is probably that he was a Mariners prospect, and so I've been following him for quite a while. But yeah, I think he's a superstar on the Reds. So interestingly, when I first made this list, I had Jordan Lawler at 2. And I think this is an example of really digging deep and watching video on a player and thinking about that player and trying to figure out whether your initial analysis based on information is mostly information filtered by others is accurate or not. So I had Lawler at 2. And then as I watched more and more video, I kept moving him down. So he's actually at 5 now for me. My number 3 is Marcelo Mayer. He might be the safest of these 5 prospects. I think there's very little doubt in my mind after reading about him and then watching him hit that he's going to be a middle of the order, 280 to 310 batting average sort of run producer for the Red Sox for the next 10 years. Really beautiful swing. The best pure hitter out of the top five I have written down here. Great hitter. I do wonder if he's going to realize all of his power. He is 6'3", but he looks to me more like a hitter right now than he does a power player. There is value in that, obviously, but I don't see 35, 40 home runs in him as much as I see 20 to 25 right now. The other thing is speed's not going to be a factor for him. So he's got to be a damn good hitter to be ranked
Right.
this high. He's not going to steal bags, and you're going to have to find that at another position. And I think we've seen at shortstop that if you don't have stolen bases from your shortstop in fantasy leagues, especially head to head, or excuse me, especially roto, you're going to have to really make up for it somewhere else. But he does have the kind of bat that makes him worth really valuing. To me, he looks like, his ceiling is 300, 400, 500 maybe, or 300, 400, 475 with 90 home or 90 runs and 90 RBIs, or even 100. That's a MVP caliber type of player. But again, knowing that he's not going to steal bases, and knowing that he may not hit for tremendous power makes him just a notch below Volpe and Marte for me. I did my notes for him as far as his swing goes, that it's a very quiet swing. His bat is upright. He makes really loud contacts. He's got a bit of an open stance, but it's a pretty swing. And I think the part of his value is that his floor is so high. His ceiling might be a little bit lower than the others, but his floor is so high that he's a very safe prospect to roster. He's my number 3.
Yeah, I mean, my eyes match what you said about his hit tool in terms of, the note I wrote down is exceptionally clean path to the ball.
Mm-hmm.
It's like you don't really even see his hands move and his bats through the zone. It's not necessarily like a really quiet lower half, but his hands just through the zone. I know how to describe it. It was just like a really clean stroke.
Mm-hmm.
Like he's setting off a tee almost.
Uh-huh.
And I was surprised as a result of that when I saw Fangraphs had his back control at a 55. Which is good, but it's not exceptional. I would have expected to see the hit tool a little higher. So we'll see how that progresses, because again, my eyes, but go more with what you're saying in terms of his ability to hit.
Mm-hmm. He made me think about Robert Hassel in our conversation about Hassel last week, because I can see him having enough back control that he can, hit the ball off the green monster and over again. And maybe his OPS hits 900 because he's a 50 doubles, 20 home run guy instead of a 30 doubles and 35 home run guy. He's got that kind of bat. So I want to pause real quick and ask you, because I think this is where you and I diverge at times as fantasy players.
Okay.
If we look at Volpe as power speed, we don't know quite the heights that he's going to reach, but power speed guy, probably average to slightly above average hit tool, but some risk, I'd say medium risk in Volpe. You look at Marte as, probably average to slightly above average hit tool, plus power, less speed than Volpe, and might have to move off the position. And so, I would say medium risk as well with Marte. I still think he's going to be great, but I'll put a medium risk on him. And then Meyer as low risk, no speed. How do you prioritize those 3 profiles as far as your rankings? And if you had the opportunity to roster one of them, which one would you roster? All things being equal.
So I'm not supposed to consider that I roster Tyler Stevenson and I have De La Cruz, right? Because
Right.
that makes me downgrade Marte just because I feel overexposed to Cincinnati.
Yeah, I would just say, without not thinking about
Yeah, not thinking
our
about
league,
that.
just think about
Right.
like
Okay.
in a vacuum.
Right. Um, I think my inclination is to go with the one that I thought had the best chance for to contribute in speed because that seems to be the category that's the most scarce.
So Volpe would be your number one then.
If I took the names off and you gave me those skills, yes.
Mhm.
I do have an emotional reaction to having a Yankees shortstop, um, as well as yeah, just I know Volpe was a bit of a pop up, but again, if you just take the names off and just gave me those skills,
Mhm.
I would favor the one that you told me gives you you know, some power, some speed
Got
with a
it.
little bit of risk.
The so Volpe was a first round pick, low first round pick. I think your point is very well taken about rostering a Yankee shortstop. I hate the Yankees. The way that I countered my hatred for the Yankees is that Volpe is part Filipino, as am I. So that was my way of like wanting to have that player on my team. But I think it's funny
Yeah,
how much
it's less about my feelings about the team, although I'm not a fan, but it's more New York is such a hard place to succeed.
got it.
One of the things that I do like about Aaron Judge is like his first taste in the majors, he struck out like 59 times
Hmm.
and walked like six. So he was horrendous.
Hmm.
And he came back and you know, and it's just not an easy place to do that. And
No, you have to be resilient.
so I just they're gonna expect him to produce from day one because of what he's done. And that doesn't mean he won't produce. I just think it's an element.
Right.
Succeeding in that market on that team is just different. So you
Well,
never know how young guys can handle it.
his it's funny because I try not to dig too much into makeup, but I think with him, he's from New Jersey, right? And so I think he's been exposed to what that market means.
Right,
And like I said before, he wasn't performing earlier this year. And
right.
so I think those things are work in his favor, I think, work in his favor as far as being able to succeed in New York. Um,
It'll be interesting to me to see do they actually bring him to the majors. Like they just don't. They're not a system or an organization that brings a lot of talent to bear through their system. I mean, I think Torres is and Judge are the only ones I can really think of. But in recent years, you know, it's they tend to trade those players for major league assets. So
right.
it'll be interesting to see if Volpe actually becomes a you know comes up as a Yankee.
I think he's I think he will. I guarantee he will. And the reason being he's local and that he's the next greatest thing. And I think that they would, as frustrated as the Yankees fans are currently, I think they would revolt if they didn't at least bring him up for a couple of years to see if he's going to be the real deal. I just I guarantee it. I don't think there's any way possible. People in New York are in love with him. I don't think
And
there's any way
that's
possible we don't see him at least for a couple years in New York. Um,
uh,
so yeah, I would say I don't know if I know I have Volpe at one. I think the um my objective analysis is I agree Volpe would be obviously I have him at one and Marte at two. I think it's closer than I care to admit. And then profile wise, like Mayer's profile is is one that I really like, but there is a little bit of hesitancy because if he's a part of the core of my team, this is when you start to have to think, okay, other positions I have to start to really prioritize steals and speed, because I have a zero at shortstop. Um, and so I like to try to start without that deficit, right? And then be able to, if there is a slight deficit at the end, I can fill in the margins. But with him, I think you're already starting behind a little bit in that steals category, and that's a little bit difficult when putting a team together. Would I love him to be the Mariners shortstop? Absolutely, absolutely. Real life wise, absolutely. Fantasy wise, because steals are so important. Um, Maybe not so much.
right.
Uh, so the final two on my list, Jackson Holiday is four. He was the number one pick overall in this June's draft, as we know, by the Baltimore Orioles. He is Matt Holiday's son. He's 18 years old. Pipeline has his tools basically as a 55 or 60 across the board. Um, my notes from the little that I watched of him, he barrels the ball. He's got a nice stroke. Obviously, he's got the pedigree because dad was a professional, very professional hitter. I think he's more talented than Matt Holliday. He will stay at shortstop. They already promoted him from rookie ball to A ball, which I think is interesting. And Baltimore is starting to prove that they can develop hitters. I think that they are an up and coming developmental organization. My ranking him here at 4 has as much to do with the fact that he has that balance that we talked about. He's got 2020, maybe 25 upside. And that's the type of profile that I think you can build a championship fantasy team with. You've got enough of those guys. I put in my notes, I think Luciano's ceiling is higher. I know we're not talking about him as a shortstop, but I think Luciano, obviously De La Cruz, that their ceilings are much higher than Jackson Holiday as far as I think both real life and fantasy, because they can hit 40 home runs. But Holiday is even at 18, I think he's a very low risk play. And I like him as a player. I don't like him quite as much as I do Volpe, but my swing notes, he's got really nice balance. He's not leveraged at all. He's got a slight toe tap, and he does use a leg kick at times, but very, very pretty swing. If he continues on the developmental path that he's shown over the first month or so, I think I would move him ahead of Marcelo pretty quickly into that number 3 spot. What did you see from Jackson Holiday?
Yeah, so his left-handed swing, it reminded me of a golf swing. There's just it was a really long, graceful swing. A lot of movement, especially when he finishes in his lower half. Yeah, I'm just
Shortened
curious.
it up. He has shortened
Yeah,
it
I'm
up a little bit
curious.
recently.
Yeah, I'm curious to see as he faces more velocity and big league hitters, how he adapts that, and then does that come in and cost me power? Is he good enough athlete to adjust? But yeah, I just saw like a really good, a little long, graceful swing, and I just wonder how it's gonna take shape as he moves into the pros.
So the last shortstop on the list for me is Jordan Lawler, 20 years old, number 6 pick overall by the Diamondbacks a couple years ago. So Fangraphs had him as 50 hit, 55 hit, 50 game, 50 raw, 60 speed, 60 field, 50 future value. He's the fastest player in the top 5. He has the highest stolen base upside in the top 5. I also think he has the greatest variance as far as end result of any of the players in the top 5. High variance prospect, tons of risk, right-handed hitter. He's an incredible athlete, right? He's explosive. Everything that I read said that he's a grinder, right? He's really he studies the game. He's very smart. You watch him hit, and you don't necessarily see a ton of swing and miss when you watch him hit. He's got really nice balance. He keeps his hands inside, but the results don't say that to me. The results say lots of swing and miss. And a player who you're kind of waiting, who has a high ground ball rate, and you're waiting for them to realize power and has swing and miss at the same time. To me, there's a lot of risk there. He's also been hurt quite a bit. He only has 373 plate appearances in the minors so far. So while he might have but he does have 30-30 upside. And the only other player you can say that about is Volpe. So the variance makes him a risky prospect. He's not one that it's not that I believe in safety in terms of rostering prospects necessarily, but he's one that is a stay away from me right now. But if he had a 25-50 season even, or a 25-40 season, I wouldn't be surprised. I think the talent is certainly there. And he was a lot of folks' number 1 prospect coming into that draft. What did you see from Lawler?
Yeah, so from the right side, what I wrote down for him is just exceptionally quick hands. Like his bat was just so fast through the zone. You can definitely see that twitch, that quick twitch, which makes in some equates to what you're saying about his speed. I mean, looking at his speed gradings, they rate him as a 60. The only 60s on our list were Oswald Peraza and Rocchio.
Mhm.
Yeah, so I mean, again, that came through with what you're saying about his ceiling in terms of speed, which is obviously such an asset. Don't love that he's a Diamondback, but yeah, it's a lot of risk there.
So you mean your comment about him as a Diamondback is just that you don't trust the Diamondbacks developmental system, correct?
Correct. Yeah.
And then if so, quick exercise before we move to your shortstop thoughts. If De La Cruz was on this list, where would he be for you? If he stayed at short, I'm going to go
That's
through
not.
the other two as well, but I'm going to start with De La Cruz.
Oh man, that's not fair.
That's fair. Come on, man. We need some kind of controversy here.
Um, let's see, because if I get a trade offer for him for one of these guys from our league and I say no, they're like, what the hell? You rated him above them.
It
Are
could
you
have
trying to
been.
be truthful or are you just trying to sound smart?
I think
Um,
that's part of the game,
right.
right?
No, I mean, I would put him at number one.
Yeah. Are you afraid about, or are you nervous about his K rate at all?
Hell yes, I
You
am.
miss. Mhm. I think it's the O'Neill Cruz lesson has been a really um big one. And I don't think you can apply it necessarily to every player who's tall and explosive like that. But seeing O'Neill Cruz not hit 200 right now is makes me a little bit hesitant or a little bit more hesitant with De La Cruz. Obviously, he's got the twice the upside of any player on this list. He's 40-40 upside and he's a switch hitter, is killing it right now. Um, I have him at 2 only because I think there is such substantial risk. And if I was to try to trade for him from you, it would cost me so much to take him on, right? Or to pry him away in any league. And there's enough risk there that you could really torpedo your team for a while in a dynasty league if you gave up the farm for De La Cruz because there's that amount of risk. That's the only reason why I very much concede that he's the only player on this list that could go 40-40, and he is the potential face of baseball in 3 years, 100%. If you had everyone's flavor of the month, Gunnar Henderson, on this list, where would you put him?
Let's see, one, two. Um, below Meyer and ahead of Holiday.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because I'm pretty much in the same boat. I think I have him. I have him actually just below Lawler. I think that he's kind of a beneficiary of the fantasy echo chamber, right? I think everyone's kind of jumped on board, and he's shown swing and miss every year except this one, and enough swing and miss that he wasn't rated super highly coming into the year. There's no doubt that he could have changed it a little bit, but I think to push him all the way up to number one overall, given that this is the first year that he's really produced at this level, makes me a bit nervous. Um, and watching his swing, there are holes, and there are holes. And when you have that level of swing and miss, major league pitching will exploit that. So, do I think he's a good player? I do. But I would rather roster any of the five we talked about, and obviously De La Cruz if Gunnar was a shortstop. And then what about Luciano? Have you watched much of Marco Luciano?
I have not. I would want to. I know that he's had a rough couple years. I'd want to look at him more closely before I answer.
So he's for me, he is number 6, so above Henderson, but below Lawler. I don't think he's staying at short. Uh, he's basically and he's power over hit, which makes me a little nervous as well. Um, but he's got a lot of power. He's got a
Yeah.
lot. And if he and he's made some, he shortened up his swing a bit and made some adjustments this year. He got hurt, so we haven't seen that big explosive, season from him. But there's 40 home runs in that bat if he stays healthy and he continues to make the adjustments. So he's one of those again that has tremendous upside as a hitter. He's also not going to contribute on the base paths. So similar to Meyer in that you have to really compensate for his deficiencies. And he's got power, whereas Meyer has that hit tool. So Meyer's a little bit, I think, a little bit safer than Luciano is currently. So that's our shortstop prospect top five as of right now. Obviously, we'll spend much more time on this in the off season, but I thought it would be fun to go over these guys and have this conversation. We are going to take a quick break, and we will be right back.
I can do open forum.
Sorry. So funny. I was having this conversation with Matt about shortstops, and I'm just going to give his dynasty rankings were Marcelo at 1, Volpe 2, Lawler 3, Marte 4, Holiday 5 out of those 5. So we all have different perspectives. We'll have to have him on to ask him why Marcelo is 1 and see what he has to say about our the kind of power speed requirement that we had talked about. All right, what you got on shortstops?
Yeah, so when we were going over the pod, I thought it would be interesting to, as you think about future shortstops and the position. My sense of the position, Tino, is after Jeter and A-Rod and those guys retired, there was kind of a period there where shortstop was kind of a less than desirable fantasy position, and then we had this rebirth with Trey and Sander and Francisco Lindor, and like the positions kind of had a renewal in the last 6 or 7 years. So I was just to just kind of look at and see where this position stands, because I haven't really done that. So just a reminder, we play in a 16-team league. It's also 9 hitters. So while we have more teams than say like a 15-team league, we don't do 2 catchers and we don't do 5 outfielders. So if you look at the entire hitting pool, if you have 16 teams, 9 spots, 144 players. So what I want to do is look and see if those top 144 sorted by WOBA, which is kind of an all-encompassing, skill, batting skill. The top 144, how many of those were shortstops, and then what did their production look like? So what I found was of those top 144, the average number of home runs or the bottom to be replacement level, you need 11 home runs. This is not shortstop, this is the entire 144. 11 home runs, 4 steals, 738 OPS, and 84 runs in RBI. So that was sort of the bottom of the player pool. So if you look at those thresholds, there were 13 shortstops that had at least 11 home runs. There were 30 shortstops that had at least 4 steals. There were 11 shortstops that had a 738 or better OPS. And there were 19 shortstops that had the 84 runs in an RBI. So there is more than enough demand for a 16-team league for a starting shortstop in both steals and counting categories. So kind of we talked before, is definitely is a position where you are going to get speed more than often than not. And you also, your shortstop doesn't tend to be a platoon player, right? They tend to play every day because of their defensive value. And so you're getting those, counting stats where if you can at least get that level, you're not getting behind.
Mm-hmm.
What it also reinforced to me is where you can gain an advantage, where there's a scarcity, is home runs and OPS. Mm-hmm. Again, there are not enough shortstops, starting shortstops, to meet that power criteria or the OPS criteria. Mm-hmm. And as you said earlier on, OPS kind of drives everything, right? And so that's where there's the biggest deficit. So if you have a shortstop that's performing over that 738 OPS, you should get it. It should be an area of advantage for you. Mm-hmm. I also looked at shortstops who are on pace for like 20 home runs. Shortstops are on pace for like 15 steals. And then shortstops who have 800 or better OPS, which there are only 5 right now. We have 6 players on pace for at least 20 home runs. So again, a 16-team league, there's only 6 of us that would typically are going to have a player forecasted at 20 home runs this year. And there were 10 shortstops who were going to hit 15 steals. The one thing I thought about too is if I removed all the sub 700 OPS speed players, how many would that take out of the pool? Because those guys really, you have to play them at a cost, like a pretty strong cost. They only took out 4 players if I did that. So it was not as much of an ad. When I saw that speed number, 30 players having at least 4 steals. I thought, well, we got a bunch of guys that just run. That wasn't the case. When I took that, I was only 4 guys. So it only goes down to 26. So
Right.
that means there are 26 shortstops who have at least 4 steals and have a better than 700 OP or better than 650 OPS,
Hmm.
which is kind of like, major league replacement. Which if you're consistently below 650, you're going to lose your job.
Right.
So those were kind of my takeaways of the position, kind of state of the position, and categorically how it stacks up. So I thought it was kind of interesting. Just any thoughts?
It's you said 11 shortstops with an OPS above 738. Is that right?
Yeah. Yes.
Huh. It's interesting. If I'm just thinking like very rudimentary, if I'm looking at shortstop, I start with, okay, is this OPS, 750 or better? That's kind of we talked about this. You would want 800 at each position, but
Right.
750 or better at shortstop and are they going to be a deficiency, have deficiencies as with power or speed, right? And so looking for that kind of balanced player, like we talked about. But it's interesting, there are only 11 that are above a 738,
Yep.
which is a pretty hard or difficult place to start because there are going to be 5 teams with below average or below
Yeah.
kind of acceptable levels of OPS.
Yeah.
It's interesting too because I think this is kind of tangential, but for me, prioritizing Tamar Johnson and Cam Collier before the draft was in part because they played premium. I felt like they played premium positions with premium bats. And I think the argument you made just now kind of solidifies that point that identifying big bats at those types of positions are maybe even more valuable than we realize.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. And I think that was kind of the thought I had of, again, as we're evaluating these future major leaguers and their skills, like what adds the most, and what adds the most punch in
right,
terms of the position.
right. The
There were 2 players that hit all. So if I looked at the home run threshold, the stolen base threshold, and the OPS as like the major, like the 3 keystone,
mhm.
there were only 2 players that hit all 3.
May I guess?
You can.
Trey Turner,
Uh-huh.
Andres Jimenez.
No. Think TGFBI as
Oh,
Lindor.
Fernando Lindor.
Yep.
Francisco Lindor, sorry.
Yep. So
How did
Turner and Lindor.
how did Jimenez not hit it?
He is missing on the home runs.
He's not projected to hit 20.
No, he's not. He'll be just short. So he'll be right on the cusp.
Got it.
But yeah, he is one of the 3 players who hit 2 of the 3.
Mhm,
Jimenez has stolen bases and OPS.
mhm,
Seager has home runs and OPS.
mhm,
And Witt has home runs and steals.
mhm,
So they're the other 3 players that met 2 of the 3 criteria.
mhm.
But all the others, that's only 6 out of 16. There were others, obviously, there were assets in one category or another, but there were only those 6 that were assets across the 3.
Mhm.
Really interesting.
How does how does that study for you impact, again, getting back to the original questions about kind of roster construction and what you're looking for at the position? How does that study impact your thoughts moving forward about the shortstop position?
I think I'd like to put a pin in that. I just worked on this morning for our discussion. I would like some time to think about it.
Sure.
I would anticipate doing this kind of analysis in the off season and
Mhm.
having more takeaways.
It's
Maybe not wanting to share all my takeaways, but I'll have some I could share.
I think that it would be a really great essay piece to write, actually. And for me, just initially, it just creates places an even greater value on the shortstops that are high OPS shortstops with speed, right? That's the easiest takeaway is there are very few of them. If you have one, hold on to them. If you see one on the list that you think will be that in the future, roster that guy, right? Identify that
Right.
guy, roster that guy. Um, the other, I guess, caveat is we don't know what's going to happen with stolen bases in the future.
Right.
Right? I think it's so volatile as far as whether teams want players to try to steal or not, or whether the player gets hurt, like we talked about with Buxton, and doesn't steal anymore. All of a sudden, their value changes. Um, which maybe there's even more safety in a player like Marcelo Mayer than we even thought. But no, I think that was super interesting. And again, my quick learning is if you've got a high OPS shortstop with a little bit of speed, hold on to them because they're rare,
Yeah, no kidding.
right? And in interest, I guess I assumed that there were more. I assumed that was something that a way in which baseball had changed a ton over the last
Right.
20 years or so. There are no
Right.
more Alvaro Espinosa type of guys,
Yeah. Yeah.
but the reality is there
I
still
think if
are.
we think of it as a kind of fantasy rich position, and I'm not gonna say that I thought going into this I knew that it wasn't,
Mm-hmm.
but I did want to kind of look at it on its face and see, especially in a deep league like ours.
Sure. Where did Swanson fall short? Out of curiosity.
Um, he only is hitting the stolen base. He is only projected to hit the stolen base
Got it.
um, of the three. He's a
Got it.
sub 800 OPS right now.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, and
I'm
he's
still angry about the asking price on Swanson and Tommy Edman 3 months ago in our league. Because I think both players were so inflated. But that's beside the point. I appreciate that study. That was awesome. And
thanks.
it does bring a lot of light to the position. That might be something that we attack in the off season is when we do our positional rankings, maybe prior to that pod, we do some sort of study on the position before we actually dig into those rankings. That's super cool. Do you have anything else? Do you have an open forum question? Anything you want to discuss?
I did. I want to throw something at you. I had
Yeah.
one and I'm scratching because I have a better one based on something that you said. I was wanting to see if you'd be willing to give some, I don't want you to have to be specific um, beyond what you'd be comfortable with, but you talked about the idea of building a core.
Mhm.
And I wondered, my open forum question is that more a core group of like certain types of skill sets or talent? Um, or is it more, do you have a certain number in mind? I'm like, I want 6 or 7 guys. That makes sense. Is it more a quantity thing, or is it more, I may have 3 core players, or I may have 9. It's just depending on which players have the attributes to make them a core player. Does that make sense?
Sure.
I guess I'm looking for a definition of
Yeah.
what that means to you and how you think about it.
Yeah. So for greater context, we keep 15 players out of our 30 in our league. And so when I say core, I'm thinking players are that I kind of that are consistent, that I can kind of set them in that position, know I have a near elite player there, and forget about having to fill that position. So on my team, if I look at my team, my core is um Acuna, uh, Julio, Buxton, although I'm starting to question that a little bit. Um, Interestingly, I consider Tamar Johnson a part of the core, even though he's still 3 years away. Um, MJ Melendez, I think, is because of his on base skills. Um, and then, whichever of the starting pitchers that I have that I decide to keep. I feel like I have more keepers than I have slots, and so I may have to try to trade them for something else in the off season. But to answer your question, it's not skills based.
Okay.
It's talent based. And it's talent based, and can I count on that talent to produce at the same level the next year? So a good example might be Andres Jimenez, who is having what is might be his career year this year, right? He might stay above 900 OPS in the middle infield. Um, but I don't know if I can count on that next year. So I don't consider him a part of my core. He's certainly keeper worthy, but I don't consider him a part of my core for the next 5 to 10 years, right? Um, I roster Jorge Polanco, who I love as a player. but I don't know if last year's Jorge Polanco is going to be who he's going to be in 23, because he's been hurt and he's been up and down this year. And so is he a part of my core? No. Is he worthy of keeping on a 15-team league? Absolutely. But I do believe in the staying power of MJ Melendez as a high OBP skilled hitter who's going to hit for power for the Royals. So some of it is my own evaluation of the particular player. And a lot of it is, again, can I count on them and not have to think about that position anymore?
Got it.
Pitching wise, it's Scherzer, it's Rodon, it's Wheeler, it's Kirby. I don't consider Gilbert a part of that core. I don't know if I trust Strider enough to be a part of that core yet. And then if I felt like I had an elite closer, that would be a part of the core as well. But the core is the part of my team that I don't have to think about going into the season. And then I get to kind of build around those players. And those are players that I anticipate being on my team for the next, until they retire, essentially.
Got it.
What were you thinking when I said it? What was that kind of your perspective?
No, not at all. I was thinking more like, yeah, just building out like the positions that you want to secure. I think was making more positional, like, okay, I have my shortstop,
Right.
or I have my SP1, or I have my catcher, and then, I have my two top outfielders, and each year I'm gonna fill in like my first baseman, or,
Right.
like
Yeah,
where I think I can so that's kind of what I wondered. Yeah.
I think purely about talent. And I
Okay.
worry about filling in position later. If I had if I had 3 elite shortstops, they'd all be a part of the core, and I'd have to figure out later how to actually implement them. Right. To me, it's,
And then I'd call you out for playing a shortstop at your util.
I wouldn't do that because I'm not trying to lose the errors category. Right. But I guess the point is just that to me, it's about talent acquisition and having having an elite core, right? Having elite, however, I'm coming to the conclusion that winning in our league specifically is about accumulating as many elite players, pitching and hitting, as you possibly can. Because a good manager, which I think most of the managers are, a good manager will be able to fill in the margins with players that can produce, right? With waiver claims, with small trades, at the deadline. But really, how many stars do you have? How many elite players do you have? What does your core look like? If you don't have star power, you're probably not going to win. At least that's how I see it. It's really hard to win without a Shohei Ohtani, right? It just is. That was part of the pain in trading Tatis, was I was giving up one of those players. I just didn't believe in Tatis anymore, and I felt like I got potential stars back. But yeah, that's how I define core in
Got it.
this particular context. You have anything else?
No.
Are you starting to think about off-season projects as much as I am?
No, I don't think I'm there yet. No. I have a lot of things I've been putting in my notebook but it's purely just writing it down so I guess I'm having off-season thoughts, but I'm just writing it down and I'm not necessarily dwelling on it.
Right. That's me too, starting that list, but I'm starting to get super excited about it. Cool. Anything else? We good?
Yeah.
Awesome. It's good to see
All
you,
right.
brother.
Enjoy it as much needed. Bye.
Likewise.